And now I'm going to introduce our guest, our very special guest. So, Noah Petro is our guest, and Noah first became interested in geology as a high school student in Bedford, New York. So for all of you there who are children or have children, this is a wonderful story about how an interest of yours can be lifelong and turn into something magical that you didn't even realize at first. While he was a student at Bates College, he was introduced to the field of planetary geology and discovered his interest wasn't confined to earth science. He followed his PhD work at Brown University and then came to NASA Goddard as a postdoc. And he stayed there, and he's still there. Noah's research focuses on the evolution of the lunar crust, specifically the role of impact cratering and distributing material across the lunar surface. He uses remotely sensed data from multiple lunar missions, as well as data and samples collected by the Apollo astronauts, to create a comprehensive picture of the moon's surface. Tonight he will be sharing that picture with us, and I'm really delighted to welcome NASA's Noah Petro, Deputy Project Scientist for the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter.
Thank you, Ellen. All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming out on a Friday night to hear me talk in Manhattan. If I'm the most exciting thing happening in the city, that's either a great thing or something's gone terribly wrong. Just as a note to all of the young folks out there, as you get older, just because you have to dress up doesn't mean you have to wear long sleeves on the hottest day of the year. That wasn't a very smart thing to do. However, I am thrilled to be here. It really means a lot to me to be at the Intrepid. As a kid, growing up in Bedford, I'd come down here quite regularly with my parents, and so to be back here as a professional, or quasi-professional, or whatever I happen to call myself, to the place where the early interest in exploration was stoked is very important for me. And so to see so many young folks here, I'm really encouraged, because I hope that you too one day get to return here, give a talk, and do a better job than I do, and dress certainly more comfortably. I'm thrilled to be here on the eve of the anniversary of our first moon landing. I was not alive when Apollo 11 happened, and in looking out in the crowd, it looks like none of you else were. So I'm going to try to shed some light on what Apollo 11 was, what Apollo was all about, and indeed what we're doing now to prepare for our return to the moon, potentially in 2024 with the Artemis program as well. I also want to make sure that I leave enough time for questions. I know that I can't answer every question in my presentation. Indeed, some of the things I may say might lead to questions, and so I really want to make sure that we have a chance to answer questions that you all may have. Right now we're celebrating a few anniversaries. Obviously, as you've been seeing in the news, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 this week, launch on the 16th, landing tomorrow. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Neil and Buzz made the first landing on the lunar surface, and then at 10:56, Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon for the first time, and so tomorrow we get to celebrate that. There's another anniversary, though, and that's July 24th. It's the day that the crew returned to the Earth carrying 48.5 pounds of moon rocks. And at that moment, science took a slight deviation because we, for the first time, had samples from the surface of another planet. And the geologic and scientific revolution that came from that, we're still feeling today. Indeed, I think many of us in planetary science are here or have these careers because of the return of those samples, starting with Apollo 11. We also commemorate 10 years of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission, 10 years of mapping the moon from orbit, changing the way we view the moon, collecting the critical data that we will use to chart our path back to the moon, and essentially telling our astronauts what they'll do when we get there. So today we'll be talking a lot about Apollo, and we'll be looking at Apollo through the lens of the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter mission. I want to take one moment before we get started I always like to show a picture of where I talk as viewed by the International Space Station. This is a picture taken by the Expedition 55 crew last April, and you can make out obviously many of the features of Manhattan, the Intrepid at the lower left there. And for those of you that stick around after the presentation, I think at 8:45 or so, there will be a flyover of the International Space Station across the sky. It should be a really good one. If it's clear, we'll get to see the space station high in the sky. It reminds me that right now we have 3 astronauts well, actually 2 astronauts and a cosmonaut on the space station. And tomorrow, coincidentally with the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing, we'll have another crew of 3 astronauts taking off from Kazakhstan to a rendezvous with the space station for the next crew. But these pictures of the Earth from orbit are always find to be spectacular, especially when you start seeing things that are familiar. You might recognize at least places that you go or travel or in fact live or work. And so for me, it's always important to have this perspective from orbit of the Earth and especially from the moon. And so we'll be looking now at a lot of pictures of the moon taken in various perspectives. If it's clear, this is what we'll see tonight. This is a rendering of the moon using the data from our Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It was full on the 16th, and so we're just past full, but hopefully with the clear skies and the telescopes, we'll get some beautiful views of the of the lunar surface, including the Apollo 11 landing site, which is going to be right around here. And so tonight, hopefully we'll have an opportunity to see that and look back where history was made almost 50 years ago. But of course, if you went outside 50 years ago tomorrow night, this is the moon that we saw. And so this is the moon, the day, actually the hour of the Apollo 11 landing. And I always like to remind myself of not only what it looked like, but if I could have been alive in 1969, this is what we'd have seen. Anytime you see a movie or any documentary that shows, talks about Apollo and shows a full moon, they're lying. This is what it looked like on July 20th, 1969. But of course, there's much more than just visualizing the moon. There's talking about how we got to the moon. And I know that I've seen a lot of the history discussed over the last several weeks about Apollo. And I think one thing that's important to remind everyone is that Apollo was not a scientific program. Apollo was a purely political program in a very different era, something that is sort of foreign to me. For those of you that were alive at the time, certainly remember that there was a Cold War going on. April of 1961 was an incredibly intense time. April 12th, Russia, the Soviet Union launched Yuri Gagarin, becoming the first human to orbit the Earth. That sent shock waves around the world, indeed in the United States. We had not yet successfully launched a human into space. 1 week later, the president asks his vice president, what can we do that promises dramatic results and that we would win, that we'd be the first in? And I want to emphasize that, dramatic results. He wanted to win. He wanted to do something first. A week after that, the vice president responds saying that the manned exploration of the moon would be of great propaganda value, but is an essential objective whether or not we're first or not. But I think we might be first, and we might be able to do it by 1966 or 1967. At this point, NASA had been developing and looking into the capabilities of what it would take to get to the moon, of how we would do it, what kind of rocket we would need, what kind of capsule we would need. The day after the vice president says that, the Wernher von Braun writes a memo back. There's a copy of it here. But basically, he says, yes, we could go to the moon. We could land a crew on the moon. And of course, I like that he says, including return capability, which is nice. Even he's thinking we have to get the crew back. He also talks about the propaganda value, that this would be a very important thing. We would not have to enter the goal of beating the Russians, but it could look like we're also doing something for science. And he thinks if we went as fast as we could do this by 1967 or 1968. Just a few days after that, Alan Shepard makes the first flight into space, 15 minutes in orbit or in suborbital trajectory. And then 20 days after that, the president gets up in front of Congress, gives this famous speech, we're going to send humans to the moon by the end of the decade and return them safely to the Earth. And what I've heard in the discussions, particularly from the Apollo astronauts about this, is that because he set such a clear goal, humans to the moon, back, end of decade, he didn't talk about, and we're going to set up a science base, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do this. That's the goal. No question, go forward and do that. One of the things that's left out of all of these discussions, though, is ultimately, apart from beating the Russians, is why do we want to do it? And so let me use the president's own words to highlight what he was thinking, at least a year after this, of why we wanted to go to the moon.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. The growth of our science and education will be enriched by new knowledge of our universe and environment, by new techniques of learning and mapping and observation, by new tools and computers for industry, medicine, and the home as well as the school. Technical institutions such as Rice will reap the harvest of these gains. And finally, the space effort itself, while still in its infancy, has already created a great number of new companies and tens and thousands of new jobs. Space and related industries are generating new demands in investment and skilled personnel, and this city and this state and this region will share greatly in this growth. What was once the furthest outpost on the old frontier of the West will be the furthest outpost on the new frontier of science and space. Houston, your city of Houston, with its manned spacecraft center, will become the heart of a large scientific and engineering community. During the next 5 years, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration expects to double the number of scientists and engineers in this area, to increase its outlays for salaries and expenses to $60 million a year, to invest some $200 million in plant and laboratory facilities, and to direct or contract for new space efforts over $1 billion from this center in this city. To be sure, all this costs us all a good deal of money. This year's space budget is 3 times what it was in January 1961, and it is greater than the space budget of the previous 8 years combined. That budget now stands at $5.4 billion a year, a staggering sum, though somewhat less than we pay for cigarettes and cigars every year. Space expenditures will soon rise some more, from 40 cents per person per week to more than 50 cents a week for every man, woman, and child in the United States. For we have given this program a high national priority, even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us.
So and I encourage everyone to watch or listen to the full speech. It's 18 minutes, and it's very inspiring because, first of all, he's an excellent speaker, unlike me, but he's also really captivating because he's talking about, well, we're going to go to the moon because it's there. It's like climbing the highest moon. It's the next mountain to climb. And incidentally, in a quirk of history, so July 20th, 1969, humans first set foot on the moon. That was Sir Edmund Hillary's 50th birthday. And for those of you that don't know, Sir Edmund Hillary was part of the team that first summited Mount Everest, some 15 or 14 years before Apollo 11 landed on the moon. So tomorrow would have been Sir Edmund Hillary's 100th birthday. And actually in the 1980s, Edmund Hillary and Neil Armstrong became quite close and friendly, actually flying to the North Pole together, which made Edmund Hillary the first person to go both the South Pole, the North Pole, and Mount Everest, along with Neil Armstrong. And so there's a really interesting little quirk of history there. So Kennedy says, we're going to the moon because it's there, it's a target, but he also later on talks about the benefits, industry, development, jobs, and careers. And at no point does he talk about science until that very last sentence. He says, and there are other benefits too. Well, I think those other benefits that we've gotten from going to the moon have paid off in tremendous dividends. They've given us, for the first time ever, a view of the solar system from those samples. Those samples tell us the fundamentals of how planets work, and indeed they've revealed the history of the Earth, a history that's largely erased from the surface of our planet today. When we look at the moon, whether from orbit from the International Space Station or indeed look at the moon reflecting back on the Earth from our spacecraft LRO looking back towards the Earth, we're constantly reminded that the two are connected. I think if there's one thing that I want folks to remember about the moon is that we should regard the moon not as a distant, isolated object 250,000 miles away, but indeed as the 8th continent of the Earth. I fundamentally believe that if we think of the moon as an extension of the Earth, that expands our knowledge of the Earth's history and indeed the history of our entire solar system. When we're looking at the lunar surface, we're looking at a record of the processes, the fundamental things that have happened in the solar system for 4.5 billion years, a record that we do not have here on the Earth. The moon is an extension of our home planet, and I think we should regard it as such. Now, there was one moment in time where that connection was made very strong, and I want to show this
On
video.
December 24th, 1968, Apollo 8 astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders became the first humans to orbit the moon and the first to witness the magnificent sight called Earthrise. Now we can see this historic event exactly as the astronauts saw it, thanks to data from NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO. LRO's superb global lunar maps, combined with the astronauts' own photographs, reveal where Apollo 8 was over the moon, and even its precise orientation in space when the astronauts first saw the Earth rising above the moon's barren horizon. It happened a few minutes after 10:30 a.m. Houston time, as Apollo 8 was coming around from the far side of the moon for the 4th time. Mission Commander Frank Borman was in the left-hand seat, preparing to turn the spacecraft to a new orientation according to the flight plan. Navigator Jim Lovell was in the spacecraft's lower equipment bay, about to make sightings on lunar landmarks with the onboard sextant. And Bill Anders was in the right-hand seat, observing the moon through his side window and taking pictures with a Hasselblad still camera fitted with a 250mm telephoto lens. Meanwhile, a second Hasselblad with an 80mm lens was mounted in Borman's front-facing window, the so-called rendezvous window, photographing the moon on an automatic timer, a new picture every 20 seconds. These photographs, matched with LRO's high-resolution terrain maps, show that Borman was still turning Apollo 8 when the Earth appeared. It was only because of the timing of this rotation that the Earthrise, which had happened on Apollo 8's 3 previous orbits but was unseen by the astronauts, now came into view in Bill Anders' side window. Here's what it looked like, as recreated from LRO data by Goddard's Scientific Visualization Studio. You'll hear the astronauts' voices as captured by Apollo 8's onboard tape recorder, beginning with Frank Borman announcing the start of the roll maneuver. And you'll see the rising Earth move from one window to another as Apollo 8 turns.
All right, we're going to roll. Ready? Set. The impact crater with just prior to the subsolar point on the south side, and the floor of it nearly evenly, because there is one dark hole, but I couldn't get a quick enough look at it to see if it might be anything volcanic. Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, is that pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick.
Oh
will you?
man, that's
Hurry.
Where is it?
Quick.
Down here?
Just grab me a color. A color exterior. There you go. Got one? Yeah, I'm looking for one. C-368. Anything, quick. Here. Okay. We missed it. Hey, I've got it right here. Let me get up this a lot clearer. Bill, I got it framed. It's very clear right here. Got it? Yep. Take several of them. Here, wait a minute. Let me just get the right setting here. Hey, calm down, Bubble. Well, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot. 250 at F11. Now there's explosion. I did. I picked you up. You sure we got it now? Yeah, it'll come up again.
For the astronauts, seeing the Earthrise was an unexpected and electrifying experience. And one of the 3 photographs taken by Bill Anders became an iconic image of the 20th century. In 2018, the International Astronomical Union commemorated the event by naming a 25-mile diameter crater Anders Earthrise. A smaller crater was given the name 8 Homeward. Both craters are visible in the iconic Earthrise photograph. I'm Andrew Chaikin, author of A Man on the Moon.
So what I love about this piece is that it uses the astronauts' own voices and their enthusiasm to explain the story. And it was important that we sent very well-trained astronauts to the moon, and particularly to the lunar surface. We should never forget they were human. And I think you hear that in their voice of, oh, come on, quick, get the camera. I mean, it's just like every family vacation I've ever been on. Where's the camera? Where's the color film? Oh, by the way, for kids, there used to be this thing called film. You put it in cameras. Some was in black and white, the things that are on your grandparents' never mind, okay. So I think it's important as we reflect on Apollo that it was not just an accomplishment, but it was a human journey. And especially over the last few days, as we've heard more from the Apollo 11 crew, as well as the other Apollo astronauts, of what an incredible journey that was. And I think we should never forget, especially as we mark Apollo 11, that humans went to the moon. People walking among us, just like you and me. They might have been test pilots, they might have been astronauts, might have become Neil Armstrong, but we're just humans. Flesh and bones like me, had the same emotions, the same responses to seeing things as we would, as you and I would. Now, how do we get to the moon? Well, one of the fundamental things that we had to do in building up to the events of July 20th, 1969 is find safe landing sites. And incidentally, this is the same thing that we're doing right now in preparation for returning humans to the moon in 2024. We have to define places that they can go and land safely. And so very early on in the mid-1960s, 5 areas were identified along the equator of the moon, on the near side of the moon. They all had to be relatively smooth. No craters, no boulders, no hazards, anything to upset the landing on the surface. The approach getting to the landing site had to be free of obstacles, mountains, valleys, anything like that. So they had to be relatively flat, broad areas. All had to be near the equator so that if there was a problem on the way to the moon, the crew could come back automatically. If you've ever seen the movie Apollo 13, by the time we got to going to the moon for Apollo 13, we moved away from the equator and started going into locations that did not have a free return trajectory. And also slope, they had to be smooth. It couldn't be on great big sides of mountains or anything like that. So we had to identify very safe, relatively benign locations. There were a number of missions leading up to Apollo that would help us chart safe landing sites. Starting with the Ranger program in the very mid-1960s, these are a series of impactor missions, essentially darts, sent to the moon to impact the surface. The goal of Ranger was to, 1, demonstrate that we could even hit the moon. 2, that we could televise images on very high frame rate, basically getting snapshots as we got closer and closer to the surface, to validate that the moon wasn't completely covered in boulders or that there were areas where we could land a lunar module. And indeed, in these images, as we get closer and closer, the landing site that would become the Apollo 11 landing site is imaged in green there. With these first very close-up pictures, we confirm that yes, the moon has broad, safe places that we could land a lunar module. After Ranger, we had Surveyor, which were a series of landed missions. I'll show some pictures of Surveyor later. And then Lunar Orbiter. These are orbital missions that image almost the entire surface of the moon, some of it at very high resolution, again, charting out safe landing sites. And the location for Apollo 11 is here indicated in green. But it was identified that, broadly speaking, in this area right here, while there are some craters, there were few enough craters that a lander could avoid them and find a safe landing site in there. And so over years and years of poring over all of this data, several landing sites were assessed. Those 5 that I showed earlier were selected, and Apollo 11 was going to be directed towards one of them. Now, originally, Apollo 8 went to the moon and imaged the first landing site, the one that was at the farthest right in this map. Oops, here. Now, eventually, Apollo 11 landed here, which has got the very technical name of 2P6. I'm not quite sure why they named it, but it was ultimately named Landing Site 2. Landing Site 2 is what became the Apollo 11 landing site. So Apollo 8 imaged the first landing site. Apollo 8 imaged that first one and deemed that it would have been a successful, safe landing site. However, and this is a little bit of a glimpse into how NASA does things, on Apollo 8, when they returned to the Earth, the crew splashed down in the Pacific in the pre-dawn hours. It was not actually splashing down during daytime. This caused some consternation. However, they had put great amount of effort and money in planning the trajectory to get Apollo 8 to the moon and back. A couple $100,000 to do that analysis in 1968. When Apollo 10 was going to go to the moon, it was going to run essentially the identical flight plan. They were going to launch at the same time, get to the moon at the same time, and again, map that first landing site, this time with a lunar module, testing the approach to that first landing site. It would return to the Earth and yet again splash down in the pre-dawn hours in the Pacific Ocean. Now, there was an enterprising young scientist who didn't take no for an answer. His name was Harrison Schmitt. He later went on to walk on the moon on Apollo 17. He was part of the planning group that was identifying these targets, and he thought, boy, it's really kind of crazy to refly the same mission to verify that that site is the same. We're not going to learn much new. Yeah, we'll learn that we can take the lunar module down, but it's not really all that compelling. Boy, we really should just delay the mission one day and check out that second landing site 2. And management at NASA said, oh, it's going to cost a lot of money and time, and we really don't want to do that. Well, on the side, he basically, Jack, convinced the people to do it. Just go ahead and do it. Well, you go ahead and do it. I'll deal with the repercussions. And so eventually he agitated enough, where eventually he got to go in front of basically the big boss at NASA headquarters saying, we really should slip this launch by a day. Well, it's going to be really expensive, Jack. I don't know. He says, but if we do it, we'll get a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean during daylight hours. And that was enough to convince headquarters to go and launch one day later than had been planned and chart out this second landing site that Apollo 10 eventually did. Unbeknownst to anybody at the time, they had already done the work, proved that they could do it, went ahead. And that was it. That was the only decision that was made to make sure that this landing site was safe. That landing site grew up to be Tranquility Base. So tomorrow at 4:17 in the afternoon, when you're listening to the replay and you hear Tranquility Base here, the Eagle has landed, know that the only reason that it was called Tranquility Base, landing in Mare Tranquillitatis as opposed to landing site 1, is because of fear of spending too much money. Some things don't change after 50 years. After Apollo 10, though, we proved that that landing site would be a safe one. We could target Apollo 11 to it, and the moment that that was confirmed, that landing site 2, became the destination for Apollo 11 in July of 1969. Let's fast forward for a moment. We're in a very different environment now. We don't have to send a series of missions to the moon to chart safe landing sites. We've been doing that for the last 10 years. The image at left is a picture of the near side of the moon, captured over many thousands of images by our wide-angle camera on LRO. At right is a map of the topography of the moon that we've been measuring from our laser altimeter. We have basically condensed a number of reconnaissance missions into our wonderful LRO mission. We've removed much of the uncertainty in where to go, how to get there, and what to do when we get to the lunar surface. This view is a slightly different one, and for those of you in the back you might not see, but this is a different data set. We're not just imaging the moon and measuring topography, we're also measuring the properties of the lunar surface. The image at right is actually a map of what we call rock abundance. I talked earlier how Apollo wanted to avoid rocky areas. Well, instead of actually sitting down and taking an image and counting rock by rock by rock, we can measure temperature changes on the lunar surface to identify places that have lots of rocks on them. If you've ever gone to the beach on a hot summer day, you'll know that in the middle of the day, that sand gets really, really hot. But if you see a big boulder or a larger rock, it's going to be a little bit cooler than the small sand. And if you come back at night, the sand cools down quite quickly, but those large rocks stay warmer longer. They have a higher thermal inertia, it's called. Well, we can measure the temperature of the surface, and by measuring the temperature change over the course of a lunar day, infer the size and population of rocks, of boulders at the lunar surface, and produce a map like this. And so with images, with topography, with rock abundance, we build up an enormous amount of data that allow us to point to locations that we know to be safe and scientifically interesting. Now, let's go back to July 1969, July 20th.
Altitude 5,200 feet.
This is the view
Okay,
out of
flight controllers,
Buzz
go
Aldrin's
for
window.
landing. Retro.
Go.
Fido.
Go.
Guidance.
Go.
Control.
Go.
Telcom.
Go.
GNC.
Go.
Econ.
Go.
Surgeon.
Go.
Capcom, we're go for landing.
Eagle, Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Copy, Phil to go. Roger, understand, go for landing, 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201. Same type, we're go.
Same type, we're go, flight. Okay,
We're go. Same type, we're go.
Flight Fido right on, real good.
Roger.
2,000 feet. Into the ag, 47 degrees. Roger. Okay, keep me advised. 47 degrees.
How's our margin looking, Bob?
It looks okay, we're about 4.5.
Roger.
Eagle looking great, your go.
2350.
Filters go,
2350, copy.
Altitude update in the eggs, looks good. Roger.
Select Fido, pings Ags. Roger.
1,400 feet, still looking very good.
You have it. We have another 1202 alarm. Roger, no sweat. Roger, 1202, we copy it.
How you doing, Control?
We look good here, fine.
Roger, how about you, Telcom? Go. Guidance, you happy?
Go.
Fido. Go.
We have another 1202 alarm. 21 down, 33 degrees. 100 feet down at 19. 540 feet down at 30. And at 15.
Attitude hold. Okay, I hold.
Attitude hold.
I think we better be quiet, fine.
Roger. Okay, the only call-outs from now on will be fuel.
10 and 50 feet down at 4. 33.5 down.
Now, as Neil and Buzz are looking out the window, they're seeing some familiar sights that they had studied in the images. But of course, there's one part of the story that we've never seen because it was not captured in this camera angle. Again, this is what Buzz Aldrin is seeing as he's looking out the window. He's looking at his gauges, he's reporting the altitude and the descent rate. And at one point he notices that they're not going down any close to the surface. They've stopped.
19 forward.
And they're hovering.
Okay, Bob, I'll be standing by for your call-out
And
shortly.
one of the things you also notice is you don't hear Neil Armstrong saying much of anything. He's not narrating, he's not describing, he's focused exactly on what he sees,
11 forward,
which is what we don't see in this window.
4.5 down.
And
5.5 down.
one of the really remarkable parts of this whole mission was that we had not just an incredible system, a spacecraft that could land on the surface of the moon, but we had a pilot,
20 feet.
an aviator in the form of Neil Armstrong, who was as calm as a cucumber. Now, his heart rate was pretty high at this point, trust me. His heart rate was going pretty fast.
5%.
But he's not panicking.
How many bite?
And in a moment after we land, I'll show you what he saw in his window. And I want you to think of the moment you recognize something terrible about to happen and how you might have
60
reacted.
seconds. Filters go, lights on.
This is the first time I saw the video we'll see in a second. I mean,
Down 2.5.
I wish I had broken out in a cold sweat now, but absolutely
Forward.
broke out in a cold sweat.
Hard copy, check. 40 feet down, 2.5. Picking up some dust.
In mission control, when they heard that first phrase, kicking up the dust, they're actually close enough to the surface to disturb the surface. They knew at that moment
30.
That they were
30 seconds.
a
30
landing
seconds.
was imminent. You just heard the 30-second call out. They have 30 seconds of fuel left. In a moment, they'll touch down.
Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ATA at a descent. Touchdown. Mode control, both auto, descent, engine command override off.
How's that?
Engine arm off.
Fantastic.
413 is in.
Do it every day. Down.
We copy you down, Eagle.
Okay, everybody, T1. Stand by for T1.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger,
And there you have it.
We copy
They had landed on the moon.
You got a bunch of guys
But the
about to turn blue. We're
anxiety of
breathing
that
again.
moment
Thanks a lot.
is sort of lost in that film. And again, I want to remind you that
Thank you.
you heard this 30-second
looking
call
good
out.
here.
They landed with about 18 seconds worth of fuel left.
Okay, we're
And
going to be
apparently
busy for a
after the
minute.
fact, when Neil Armstrong came back, he said, well, we all know that when your car engine light comes on, the empty light comes on, you still have a little bit of fuel left anyway. Talk about a cool customer. This is what Neil Armstrong saw out of his window at the left. We have on the right that video that we just saw. At the left is Neil Armstrong's view. And so what he sees
100 feet down at 19.
is his lunar module is about to land on
540
the
feet
floor
down at
of that
30,
great crater.
Down at 15.
He sees that there's boulders all around it, and he sees that if he doesn't do something, he's going to have to,
At
well,
400 feet
it's either
down at
crash
9.
or take control. So he takes control of
forward.
the lunar module and ends up going
10 and 50
further,
feet down at
several
4.
hundred meters downrange from that large crater that he flew over. He doesn't panic. You don't hear in his voice, Houston, we got a huge problem coming on here. He takes control of the problem and ends up going long. Now, the whole time, he's also not telling Buzz Aldrin this. Buzz Aldrin's wondering, why aren't we landing? Buzz Aldrin's using his body language to push the lunar module down to the surface. And of course, eventually, they're going. Neil is also doing another thing. As much as he's looking for a smooth spot, he's also knowing that he'll be out on the lunar surface for 2.5 hours. What am I going to do there? So he sees this crater here. He sees a smooth area just behind it and says, that's where I'm going to land. And oh, by the way, while I'm on the surface, I might go investigate that small crater. Now, at the left is an image taken by LRO. In a moment, you'll see in that image the bottom half of the lunar module sitting on the surface there. And so as he's slowly edging towards the surface, finding the exact spot he's doing, he's essentially starting in his mind the plan of what am I going to do when I'm on the surface? Well, I know I want to go find that crater because I've been told craters are important.
5%.
And so in this picture here now, we see the picture taken by our LRO spacecraft a few years ago where you can actually see the hardware sitting on the surface.
6 forward.
This is the first picture taken from the window of the lunar module after landing, showing that barren, smooth landscape. And as much as I said earlier on that we wanted to find boulder-free, hazard-free areas, the place their lunar module was taking them was indeed boulder-rich and had a big crater on it. So even when, at the time, we did the best we could mapping, it still came up short for the Apollo 11 crew. But because there are humans in it, particularly a very cool customer, Neil Armstrong, they were able to successfully land. And basically what they were able to do over the next 2.5 hours after they started their EVA is conduct one of the most incredible examples of a geologic exploration of a planetary body we could ever hope for. This is a view of the Apollo 11 landing site taken by our spacecraft, LRO. You can see in the middle, the bottom half of the lunar module sitting on the surface today. You can see parts of the legs, the landing struts. You can see a small white dot there. That's one of the backpacks that was thrown out of the spacecraft before they left the moon. You can see hardware, experiments left behind on the lunar surface, and indeed the boot prints, the footprints of the astronauts that they left during their EVA. And again, 2.5 hours. I defy you to find a more productive 2.5 hours in all of human history. They found and sampled 48.5 pounds of moon rock, set up experiments, and spent about 1.5 minutes of that time talking to the president. You can also see where they set up the camera. Excuse me. And in between there is where they set up the American flag. On ascent, when they took off from the surface, Buzz Aldrin reported that he saw the American flag get knocked down. Indeed, at each of the other Apollo landing sites, we see the shadow of the flag at each of the other Apollo landing sites. Excuse me. This is an image taken by Neil Armstrong. He's standing at the rim of that very small crater that he saw as he went over and flew over the landing site. He remembered from his training how important impact craters were and knew that he should go over and take pictures of it. This was really the first scientific investigation on the surface of a planet. He recognized the importance of getting that data and went over and collected it. Indeed, the second greatest thing that he did as they were closing out the mission, getting ready to leave, the folks in Houston were urging them to get back in the lunar module, is he recognized that the box that they had put all the samples in was essentially empty. A few samples in there, rocks. And so he took the box and started scooping in the dirt, the regolith, that loose material on the surface, filling it with as much material as he could. He felt that going all the way to the moon and coming back with a suitcase that's half full or half empty would not be worth it. And so he made sure that he got as much material into that sample box as he could. And that sample, which we call 10084, became one of the most important samples ever collected in all of Apollo. Even though Apollo 11 was a science mission, it was an engineering mission, it was one of the most important samples because it told us about that area, that surface they landed in, and what we could learn from it. 50 years later, we're still studying those samples that Neil and Buzz collected, still finding out new and interesting things about the history of the solar system as recorded in those rocks. For context, here's the path that the astronauts took over that 2.5 hours, overlaying on the deck of the Intrepid here. Essentially, you could do that entire EVA on the deck of the Intrepid. I want to point out that this image was constructed by a colleague of mine, Brent Gary, whose grandfather was a commanding officer in the Intrepid in the 1960s. What's most impressive about this is that we look at the Apollo 11 event as one of these most monumental achievements in human history, but it's very small. You could fit that in the infield of a baseball diamond. You could fit that on the 50-yard line of a football field and not score a touchdown. And yet over those 2.5 hours, that brave crew accomplished one of the greatest achievements in human history, and at the same time did some amazing science. Now, Apollo 11 was just the first of what would be a number of missions. In November of 1969, the Apollo 12 crew landed on the moon, also close to the equator. You'll notice that most of the landings occur when the sun is low in the sky so that the astronauts could see the hazards before them with long shadows of all the boulders. Apollo 13 was supposed to happen in April of 1970. Of course, they had their accident. Apollo 14 came in February 1971, also near the equator. This was the first geologic mission that was targeted to a very specific feature on the lunar surface to help unravel the geology of the moon. Apollo 15, we start going away from the equator. This is the first mission with the rover. It was several days on the lunar surface. This was also targeted to understand the formation of a very large impact crater called the Imbrium Basin. In April of 1972, Apollo 16 goes to the rugged highlands of the moon, the ancient crust of the moon, far away from volcanic activity. Indeed, they went to that location expecting to find volcanism. Indeed, they found that there was very little, if any, volcanism there, but mostly the effects of impact cratering on the lunar surface. Finally, with Apollo 17, targeted to go as far away from the other missions as possible, also on the equator of the moon, its goal to sample material from a different basin and a different geologic area. So with the sum total of the Apollo missions, we're left with a very limited view of the moon. I want to remind you the moon is roughly the same surface area as the continent of Africa. With Apollo, we went to 6 locations, all roughly around the equator on the near side. Eventually, I'll show you our plans for the return to the moon with humans. But whenever you hear someone say, well, we've been to the moon, we've done that, I defy any of you to pick 6 locations in New York and Manhattan that perfectly describe the entire city or perfectly describe the entire borough. You can't do that. These 6 locations give us the great starting off point of understanding the moon, but we have so much left to understand in terms of lunar history and indeed in terms of solar system history. This is a view of the Apollo 12 landing site taken by our LRO spacecraft. You'll notice, again, we can see the bottom half of the lunar module. Up here we see several of the experiments that were set up and left running for many years after the mission left. You can see the boot prints of the astronauts. But you also see an interesting feature right here. That's the Surveyor 3 lander. Apollo 11, because they had really only the goal of landing on the moon and coming back, really didn't have a specific target. They wanted to land in a rough area, a broad area. They were able to do that. But with Apollo 12, we wanted to do better. We wanted to have a pinpoint landing. And so they set the Surveyor 3 as the target, the destination for that mission. There were some who thought that was too risky by setting that clear goal of landing at a feature. If they missed it, the mission would have been viewed as a failure. Well, indeed, they landed right on the rim of a crater within a few meters, a few tens of meters of the Surveyor 3 lander. The picture at right is a picture taken from that lander several years before. That picture was all they had of the information of where it had landed. It took a team of people poring over dozens of images trying to find the one crater where they could identify some of these boulders and some of the features in the distance to pinpoint that landing site. Indeed, I think the crew themselves were somewhat skeptical that they would be able to find it. And indeed, on their descent, when they first spot that Surveyor 3 lander on the surface, you can hear the euphoria in their voice. Ah, we actually found it. Great. And indeed, they had found the Surveyor 3 lander. They sampled pieces off of the lander. They took the television camera off of it and brought that back to the Earth, in addition to the several more pounds of rock that they brought back. Apollo 14, as I mentioned, was the first of the scientifically targeted missions. The lander is here. They took a much longer traverse. Their goal was to get to the top of this crater, Cone Crater. You can see it's got a bit of a rise to it. It's a bit of a mountain. And so one of the troubles that crew ran into was the trouble of navigating on the lunar surface. There's no atmosphere, no trees, there's no frame of reference, and so they found it very hard to judge distances. Indeed, they got about 20 meters shy of getting to the summit of Cone Crater before having been told to have to turn back. And so one of the problems that they uncovered is navigating on the lunar surface is very difficult. Judging distances is very difficult. With the type of data that we have now, we can support and train the astronauts in how to recognize either visual clues or indeed identify where they are on the lunar surface. The images that they had before Apollo 14 did not reveal nearly any of this detail, which you can imagine. If you're walking along, you can pick out surface features around you, crater to crater to crater, boulder here, basically using the known reference points that we can see in our images as tools to navigate around the surface. Basically, we want to retire the risk that any astronaut on the lunar surface will ever get lost again. Of course, they knew how to get back to their lunar module. They could follow their footsteps back. But we want to make sure that when we have specific geologic targets, that they know where to go. Now, with subsequent missions after Apollo 14, the capabilities of the missions got greater. We could go to the moon longer for 3 days, and we had a rover. Now, before I mentioned how we wanted to avoid blocky areas. We wanted to avoid craters. Apollo 16, we wanted to go to rocky areas. We wanted to go to craters. So this is an area, again, in the rugged highlands of the moon. Apollo 16 landed in the middle of these two bright craters, North Ray and South Ray crater. We wanted to sample fresh material, and so we had to get up close to craters. Well, with the great support that the rover gave us, we could land further away from those hazards and actually drive up to them. And indeed, if we compare this visualization and add that rock abundance layer to it, you can see that instead of avoiding rocky areas, you can see there's some reds here, we actually were targeting rocky areas. And that's something we're going to want to do in the future as well. As a geologist, we want rocks. We don't want to avoid big rocks. We want to go get them. And so as opposed to using these types of data sets to tell us where not to go, they're going to help us find where we want to go and get to those locations safely. And lastly, we're going to talk about my favorite landing site, the Apollo 17 landing site. Only less than 4 years after the Apollo 8 mission, we were able to land humans on the surface of the moon, have them work there for 3 days, and indeed land in a valley on the moon deeper than the Grand Canyon. This could only be done because we had confidence in the system, we had confidence in the lunar module. We also had confidence that the command module pilot on the very last orbit over the landing site could precisely navigate and know exactly where they were, so they had confidence that the lunar module would basically follow a trajectory right to the middle of the valley, right to here. And so over the 3 days the Apollo 17 crew was on the surface of the moon, And incidentally, one of the crew members on that mission was Jack Schmitt, that same geologist who convinced NASA to send Apollo 10 to the second landing site, which became the Apollo 11 landing site. He was able to participate in the investigation on the lunar surface, really realizing now what is every planetary scientist's dream of exploring their field site. And over 3 days, they explored a broad area of the moon, exploring both impact craters, a tectonic feature, a landslide, volcanic lava flows, and indeed a very unique feature at Shorty Crater, which I'll highlight in a moment here. And so over those 4 days, or 3 days of that exploration, Apollo 17 became the pinnacle of our exploration. I think what's most disappointing is that there was at one point an Apollo 18, 19, and 20 mission that those had gotten canceled several years before. By the time Apollo 17 happened, we had solved many of the problems of the previous missions. It was essentially a flawless mission. The hardware worked perfectly, the crew worked perfectly, everything went essentially as planned. The one thing that we didn't plan is that by having a geologist there, we didn't have to do as much pre-planning. He knew what to do when he got there. And I think one of the benefits that we've learned about sending a geologist to the moon is that a trained scientist can act with a certain amount of autonomy when they're on the surface of any planet in the solar system. So when we send humans to Mars, we should send a geologist. That won't be me. Hopefully it's one of you. I've got a little bit too much mass around my midsection and a little bit too much responsibility at home to allow me to go away for 3 years to go to Mars. But when we go to Mars, we're going to want to do better than Apollo 17. And when we go back to the moon, we're going to want to build on the successes of all of these Apollo missions and not only send geologists, but geologically trained astronauts to conduct the best field investigations we could imagine. This is an oblique view of the Apollo 17 landing site. Again, this Taurus Littrow Valley, deeper than the Grand Canyon. I want to point out that Shorty Crater. You see it's a little dark smudge right there, and actually if I go to the next image, which is taken at a slightly higher sun angle, so this is where the sun is directly overhead, we see color differences much better. You see a very dark spot right there. That's Shorty Crater. Incidentally, does anybody know the book Trout Fishing in America from the 1960s? Okay, so Trout Fishing in America, I haven't read it, but I think it's probably safe to say it's a quintessential 1960s American book. I'll let everybody decide what they think that means. And apparently there's a character in it named Shorty. And Jack Schmitt, who is not the buttoned-up test pilot aviator type, read that book and started naming features on the moon after that. So Shorty Crater there is named after a character in that book, incidentally. So at the time, before the mission, they saw that dark crater there, and they thought that might have been a volcano. Well, that'd be interesting to go sample an actual small volcano on the surface of the moon. Well, of course, as they explored it, they realized it probably wasn't, but there was one discovery waiting for them that they hadn't anticipated. So let's go back to December of 1972 and hear Jack Schmitt describe that discovery.
Okay. Oh, hey! Wait a minute. What? Where are the reflections? I've been fooled. There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange! Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange. Wait a minute, let me put my visor up. It's still orange. Sure it is. Crazy. Orange. I've got to dig a trench, Houston. Copy that. I guess they better work fast. It really is. Same color as
So what we hear there is Jack Schmitt essentially literally stumbling across one of the most profound discoveries of the Apollo program. They had not planned to find this orange soil there. They did not know that it would be there waiting for them. You heard several things. First of all, his excitement, but you also hear him almost immediately falling into this, I've got to dig a trench, Houston. I've found something. I know we have this protocol, we have this checklist. I need to do something different because this discovery is more important than whatever we had planned. I'm going to dig a trench. I'm going to sample the material. They did a core tube. But you also hear mission control saying, got to do it quickly because we got to be out of here in 10 minutes. And so one of the most profound discoveries that we made on the moon was both time limited and also resource limited. It turns out that that orange material that they sampled were small glass beads, volcanic glass beads, that had been erupted on the surface several billion years before. The orange in those glass beads was caused by titanium in them. And indeed, about 10 years ago, a group of scientists based at Brown and Columbia here analyzed those glass beads and found water in those glass beads. Water that comes from the deep interior of the moon. Water that was remnant from when the moon formed. That profound discovery wouldn't have happened if we had sent a robot there. I'm not sure we would have gotten the right amount of samples if we hadn't sent a geologist there. But that discovery has profoundly changed our view of the moon and indeed the rest of the solar system. The fact that there's water in the moon tells us that there's water that could seed the moon later in life. We know there's water elsewhere in the moon. We know there's water at the pole of the moon. And indeed, if there's water at the moon and there's water in the moon, then the formation of the moon must have not been as violent as we had thought to boil off all those volatiles. That tells us that perhaps there's water everywhere in the solar system. We know there's been water on Mars, but we think now there may have been water inside Mars early in its history, and that water that we saw or think may have flowed across the surface may have come from the formation of Mars. And indeed, the discovery of water in the moon has now cascaded 10 years later with the goal of returning to the moon to use and get the water out of the crust of the moon. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up in 1 minute. Just say Apollo 17 would not fit on the deck of the Intrepid. Indeed, you could cross the entire island of Manhattan during their 3 traverses. And so we turn our back on the Apollo missions now and look forward to the south pole of the moon, where we're going to go with the Artemis program. In 2024, with the first landing of the next woman, and the first woman and next man is going to explore this area of the moon, to use that water that we know exists here to sustain a presence at the moon longer than the 3 days of Apollo. Indeed, for many, many years, we hope to see humans exploring the south pole of the moon, using the water that we know there to sustain a presence, and eventually turn that into rocket fuel to propel us onto Mars. With that, I thank you, take some questions, and conclude my day.
Okay, so because we started a bit late and Noah ran a bit late and there are people waiting outside to come in and see the pavilion, one question, and then Noah will be around. He's not going to run away, so you can informally catch him and ask him a question. So one good
Right here
question.
in the front, right in front of you there,
This
Ellen.
one?
Up
Okay,
there.
you got it.
How many Apollos are there? Were there?
How many Apollos were there? So there was
This is a
Apollo
short
7.
question. I'll give you 2 questions.
What's that? Okay, Apollo 7 was the first one that orbited the Earth just to test the spacecraft out. Apollo 8 went to the moon. Apollo 9 tested the lunar lander and the command module in orbit around the Earth. Apollo 10 tested them at the moon. And Apollo 11 and 12 went to the lunar surface. Apollo 13 had an accident. They didn't get to the moon. 14, 15, 16, and 17 made their way to the moon. So there were 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 11 Apollo missions.
Okay, Noah, back
Yes.
here. Noah, back here.
Okay, yep.
This is going to be our one question.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
And I'm just checking to see that the flyover of the space station is still going to be clear tonight, so I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, the question is this. Between Apollo 11 and Apollo 17, the time of staying on the moon went from a few hours to a few days. Obviously, that meant more life support material, et cetera, in the lunar module. How was that accommodated from an engineering standpoint?
Okay.
Was the lunar module larger or re-engineered somehow?
So the lunar module stayed the same size, but they reduced mass in it. They were able to find ways to not fly as much material. In fact, Apollo 11, the crew wanted to add reflective foil around the legs because they were worried about being able to descend to the surface with the engine on. They wanted to get much closer. They found ways to strip mass off the lunar module so they could fit more oxygen, food, and also more fuel so they get more samples back up to the Earth, back up to lunar orbit and then back to Earth. So it became an engineering problem. The first set of lunar modules they knew were too heavy to do lots of experiments. They also were bringing more experiments to the surface as well. So it became an engineering thing. They had to fit less mass into the same volume of space. And that was done at Bethpage, Long Island. The Grumman facility there built the lunar module. But they all looked essentially the same, had the same volume. They had to fit in the same Saturn V rocket as they were launching. So it was all the same. So in 11 minutes, the space station will fly over for 6 minutes, coming from, it will start from the southwest and fly over to the northeast.
Okay, that's it for this evening. There are telescopes outside for those of you who want to see the moon or catch the ISS. And Noah's around, and thank you
Yep.
all so
And
much for coming.
I'll be right here for more questions. Come on up. Thank you, everybody.
See you next month.
Yep.